Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, everyone, wherever you are. We are welcoming you for the gLOCAL2023 event hosted by the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. And we are welcoming you from South Korea. And also we have speaker from Rome. My name is Anastasia Aladysheva, and I'm an impact evaluation specialist at interim at the Independent Evaluation Unit at GCF. So I'll be moderating a session on the lessons from impact evaluations of climate change interventions. So while waiting for us to start, please be sure to follow us on the social media, where you can find more about our impact evaluation program, but also other work that IEU does. So in our program, today we have 3 speakers. My colleague and evaluation specialist Susumu Yoshida will present the findings from the Learning-Oriented Real-Time Impact Assessment Program, LORTA. Then Nidhila Adusumalli, Impact Evaluation Analyst at the World Food Program, will present the impact evaluation study on measuring the impact of preparedness or anticipatory actions in Nepal. So this study will focus on humanitarian settings and how impact evaluation can be conducted for humanitarian assistance, projects, or programs. And we have a 3rd speaker, Assistant Professor Joshua Merfeld from Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy and Management, who will talk about doing research on the effects of climate change. In particular, the impact of changes in climate on labor allocation patterns. So then we will follow with a Q&A session. It will be around 10 minutes and closing remarks. So without making you wait, I'll give the floor to Susumu to speak about LORTA. Over to you, Susumu.
Thank you, Anna. Can you hear me okay? And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Nidhi and Josh, for joining me today for this LORTA session. And of course, thank you all the participants who are connecting online. Thank you for coming. Hi, my name is Susumu Yoshida. I'm an evaluation specialist at the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. I'm a little bit distracted because I see so many Jennifer connecting to this session today, but okay, here it is, so let's go from there. Okay, so today I'm going to briefly talk about our LORTA program here at the IEU, but for those who are not so familiar with the Green Climate Fund, so GCF is the largest climate fund in the world, with its portfolio of about $12 billion US, with co-financing, we are leveraging about $45 billion US, and we have projects and programs in climate mitigation and adaptation project invest in the developing countries. So basically what LORTA does is we do an impact assessment of these GCF funded activities, and also we do capacity building around impact assessment. Okay, so LORTA stands for a learning-oriented real-time impact assessment program, which we started in 2018. So it's been running about 5 years so far, and it operates under 3 principles, which are learning, real-time, and impact. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. Excuse me. So we have about, we onboarded about 25 projects for up to now, and we have about 22 projects which are active and ongoing. Since a GCF portfolio number of projects are about 200, so we are conducting impact assessment for about 10% of the GCF funded activities. And these are the some of the climate topics that we are working on to generate evidence. As you can see, some early warning systems, and of course, agriculture and food security issues, and then the forest and the land use, and water security, energy in other areas. So the way how we work is that we conduct and start from the annual impact evaluation design workshop that we conduct every year, which we cover about why we need this kind of assessment and how it is different from regular or standard monitoring and evaluations, and how we set up the research questions or research evaluation questions and the theory of change, how to design or develop a theory of change, and the indicators, research ethics, so that the team is ready to start thinking about how to measure its impact of this investment. So this year, we are planning to have this design workshop in 2 weeks, I think, that probably some of the participants today will be joining this workshop. So we are looking forward to working with you this year. And after this workshop, we select a few projects to this LORTA program so that we can spend more time to discuss about the more detail of each project context, going to the field, and then agree on what needs to be evaluated and how we are going to evaluate, which kind of method we're going to use, and what is the data collection plans so that we can make analysis. As you can see, as you can see, many of the projects are still at the early stage of the evaluation cycle. We have some ongoing on the data collection, like a baseline, midline, and endline. But for the moment, we have only one completed study in Malawi, which we test the farmer field schools, and then the intervention is using the historical climate record to inform the behavior and the decision of the farmers, how it's going to help cope with the climate change, or to be resilient, to increase the resilience by adapting to these setups. So you can find this study on our website, so you can check if you're interested in. Okay, so we work with GCF work with the international accredited entities and then the direct access entities. In our portfolio, we have a balance of portfolio. About half we work with the international, such as UNDP, FAO, and IFAD. And then the other half, we work with the domestic or national or regional entities. And for today, we are going to talk a little bit about the project that we work in the Philippines, which is on here with the Land Bank. That is an accredited entity of this project. This is a brief timeline from the inception of this program, but let me skip here today and straight into the project in the Philippines. So this is a multi-hazard impact-based forecasting and early warning system project in the Philippines again. The objective of the project are to reduce the exposure of vulnerable communities to climate-induced hazards and strengthen their absorptive and adaptive capacities to better manage or adjust to impacts brought by climate shocks and climate change, and implement long-term climate risk reduction and adaptation measures. Okay. And these are the components, but let me skip here. Okay. So the setup of this project is, back. So we have here GCF, who is a funder, and IEU, we are within the GCF. But the accredited entity is a land bank in the Philippines. And we have a lead executing entity, which implement the project by Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Services Administration, PAGASA. But we have also 8 co-executing entities, including local government units. As you can see, this project has several components listed here. But today, I'm not going to talk too much on the project or what we are doing within this project setup, because the focus of this session is about the future of monitoring and evaluation, and also the importance of partnership, how different entities can work together. So I'm going to focus on that aspect. So as you can see, WFP, World Food Program, is one of the core executing entities within this project, and they are responsible for conducting the absorptive capacity and risk perception studies, independent from impact evaluation of the overall project that we are conducting, right? And they are supposed to do a baseline studies for their as part of their responsibility. And since we, as the IEU, we are conducting impact assessment of the overall project, we have been working with the Land Bank and the PAGASA, and also the WFP teams in the Philippines, and to try to think how we can leverage the resources, like financial and also the human like expertise that each institution or each team have. So without any partnership or collaborations, these things get done without too much coordination. So of course, they do baseline study for absorptive capacity and risk perception, and we conduct the baseline data collection and analysis for our impact assessment. As you know, the impact assessment, we need a baseline and the midline or like the final data collection so that we can measure the causal impact, right? So with the help of Land Bank, not the help, but with the leadership of the Land Bank and PAGASA, we started the discussion to see how we can leverage and do together. So we developed the TOR together, and so that we can use the same data set to address or to meet for both needs. And because each institution have a different mandate or different focus, but of course in this project setup, we have some common space that which can address from the both parties, right? So I think that is a good way of doing this kind of exercise. Of course, it requires some coordination effort, but I think the idea is like how we can do this more systematically or to a broaden setups. So I think that's why we invited WFP today for this session to hear, not to talk about in this context again, but to learn from other programs that they are working on the climate space, so that we can see how we can do more collaboration or in the climate space. Similarly, for Josh, he's going to talk about from the academia side, he's with the KDI school, which is a research and a graduate school in Korea. So we can try to see more collaboration locally to work on the similar space. Okay, so that's all from us today. And I hope if you have any questions or need more information, so please contact us, and we are happy to get in touch. And also, of course, I said WFP and the KDI, but all the participants from today, we can see how we can collaborate more and do tackle the climate change, because that's something that we cannot do individually, but we need really a collective actions to address the challenge. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susumu, for this thorough overview of the IEU LORTA program and providing an example that we do in the Philippines. Now, I would like to ask participants if they have any questions or comments or any reflections, you can put it in the chat box, and then we come back to them at the very end after all the presentations. So now I give floor to Nidhi, who will be talking about the impact evaluation of preparedness program in Nepal. So now over to you, Nidhi.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. My name is Nidhila, and I am an impact evaluation analyst with the Impact Evaluation Unit in WFP's Office of Evaluation. I'm going to be talking a little bit about impact evaluations in humanitarian settings, and more specifically about our work in Nepal, where we're focusing on anticipatory action in the context of floods. I also want to say that we're joined by my colleague Kriti Malhotra, who's currently in the field in Nepal. Yeah. Next slide, please. Great. I just want to start with mentioning the impact evaluation strategy at WFP, which envisions the use of rigorous impact evaluation evidence to inform policy and programmatic decisions, to optimize interventions and provide thought leadership to global efforts in order to end hunger and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. At the IEU unit at WFP, we have four key focus areas. We call them windows. The first is the cash-based transfers and gender window. The second is the climate change and resilience window. We also have a window on school-based programming. This year, we're going to launch a new window on nutrition. So that's going to happen this year. We also have a cross-cutting work stream that deals with optimizing humanitarian interventions using impact evaluations, under which we have four key focus areas. The first is preparedness. This is also where our anticipatory action work fits in. We also do IEs on targeting or improving targeting mechanisms for programs. Then there is the intervention focus area, which includes cash-based transfers. And the fourth area, which is transitions or peace building and social cohesion. Next slide, please. Now, this is not a surprise to anyone that climate change is increasing the frequency of the extreme weather events that are taking place in the world now. And since the last decade or so, the number of disasters that have occurred have actually quadrupled. What this has brought about is an increased interest in anticipatory action as a key policy solution for humanitarian actors working in the space of climate-related hazards. And why is this evidence important? It's important to improve programming and also for donors who are making decisions to invest on anticipatory action across the globe. Next slide, please. All right, so before we start, what even is anticipatory action, right? So anticipatory action can include a suite of actions, which can be, cash-based or in-kind transfers, early warning messaging, livelihood inputs, health kits, a bunch of different things, right? But all of this happens before or during the climate shock peak, right? And these actions are based on certain probabilistic forecasts or triggers with predetermined thresholds. Now, once these triggers are met or once those predetermined thresholds are reached and your funding is approved, these activities are rolled out in a span of a couple of days or even hours in some cases, right? And the rationale behind this is that anticipatory action allows households to prepare for that climate shock, which may include evacuation or migrating to a safer place, saving their livestock, reinforcing or fortifying their, say, houses or fields, and as well as saving, their crops and seeds from water damage. Next slide, please. The key research question that we are focusing on in this impact evaluation is, do early or anticipatory action cash transfers help households cope better with the impacts of the climatic shock as compared to later transfers, or what we call post-shock transfers, right? And one may ask, why don't you just help everyone before or as early as you can, right? The reason there is there are a lot of uncertainties that come about with during these climatic shocks. One could be, whether the flood what is the severity of the flood, or say the drought event. Where is it happening? What are the locations where it is more severe? And whether that area has like a fully functioning market, and can cash actually be used in those markets or not. So there are a lot of uncertainties that surround this. And there's always that trade-off between the speed of providing assistance and the precision with which you reach the most severely affected households or the most vulnerable households. And assisting early may also, come with its downsides of not reaching the people who are actually the most severely affected. Next slide, please. Coming to our anticipatory action pilot in Nepal. This has been happening since October last year, and we are collaborating with the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation Unit, or DIME, and the IE is funded by USAID, and the entire program comes under UN SURF, and that's how it's funded as well. Now in Nepal, under this program, they've included two river basins, Koshi and Kanali Basin, Koshi in the east and Kanali in the west, with 4 districts across these basins being part of the impact evaluation, 6 in total and 4 under the IE. These obviously are dependent on the flood triggers, and just as we thought, because these are localized triggers, which means that the east has its own trigger mechanism and the west has its own. And what happened in October was that only the west basin, which is the Kanali Basin, got activated. So under the IE, we included Kailali and Bardia in the west basin. Under this program, WFP had included 26,000 households based on certain vulnerabilities criteria and scores. And you can imagine this is quite a massive program, and this is probably the first time that such a massive program is being conducted. I was mentioning certain predetermined triggers and thresholds that exist. In this case, it was a 2-step trigger process. The first level is the readiness trigger or the pre-activation trigger, which comes with a lead time of 7 days. And the second is the action or the activation trigger, which comes with a 3-day lead time. The program gave about 15,000 Nepali rupees, which at the time was about $111 US cash in hand. And the early warning messaging was delivered to everyone. Next slide, please. So we followed for this IE a clustered randomized controlled trial approach, a clustered RCT approach for some of you who may be familiar. And we included 140 villages. And these were randomly allocated into 2 groups of 70 villages each. One thing to note here is that all of these 140 villages came from the same pool of beneficiaries with the similar vulnerability scores in them. So the first group, which is the anticipatory action or the AA group, had 70 villages, and they received the 15,000 Nepali rupees as cash before or just during the flood peak. And the second group, which is the post-shock group or the later transfers group, received the cash a few weeks after the flood peak. Yeah, next slide, please. This is what the timeline looks like a little bit. In October last year, the triggers were activated in the Karnali Chisapani basin. And in October, November, the AA transfers were sent out to the households. In November last year, the first round of data collection happened. And in November, December, the post-shock households received their transfers. And in January 2023, this year, we did the second round of data collection. And currently in May, we are in the middle of the third round of data collection. And this will be complemented by a qualitative component as well after this in June. I mentioned earlier, Kriti is in Nepal for this impact evaluation data collection at the moment. Next slide, please. We at the IEU are also building our anticipatory action IE portfolios in other countries. Currently, we're working in Nepal, that's ongoing, but we're also going to start IEs in the Philippines, as well as the Dominican Republic in Bangladesh, and potentially another IE in Nepal as well, which would be sort of, we're calling it Nepal 2.0, but like a scale up of the same, right, with additional components. In Bangladesh, the pilot design is similar to what was in Nepal, with an additional group added, which is the longer post-shock group, which receives the cash many weeks after the flood peak. Yeah, I think that's all I had time for today, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nidhi, for this presentation and for the interesting case study that you have in Nepal, and looking forward to also seeing some results from the impact evaluation in Bangladesh. We're also completing phase 3, basically. We're writing an impact evaluation report for Bangladesh. It's not an early warning system, it's more livelihood support and water intervention, but it's good to know that you're doing another study in this country. So now it's over to you, Josh, to present your research on climate change and impact on labor. Over to you.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. I want to thank Susumu Yoshida for inviting me to present here. He asked me to present some academic work, but I don't want to bore you too much. I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about some of the difficulties as a development economist in trying to tease out some of the effects of climate change specifically, especially when we think about a lot of socioeconomic outcomes. So these slides are in theory based on this paper with Rajiv Dehejia, who's my co-author. But I'm only going to show you some really brief results from that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about some of these challenges. So looking at the effects of climate change on socioeconomic outcomes is actually kind of difficult. And part of the reason for this is that people's responses to shocks are not necessarily the same as their responses to climate change. So let me give you an example. Right? So when we think about shocks, so we just heard about floods, for example. One of the things about climate change is that it's on average increasing basically increasing the probability of these extreme weather events. So both floods and droughts, actually. And so when we think about one of these extreme weather events, like a flood, right? So a household may have the ability to cope with one shock, right? So say you're a rural farmer in sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe you own a dozen goats, and you have a bad farming year. Well, one thing you can do is you can maybe sell some of your goats to help you kind of, stabilize during this bad period. And then, next year on average won't be as bad. So maybe you buy some more goats back, and basically your stock of goats is going up and down to kind of help you try to smooth your consumption over time in response to these shocks. But what climate change does is that it makes these shocks more common. So all of a sudden, this farmer who might have actually been able before to help smooth their consumption over goats, now all of a sudden finds themselves having to sell goats way more often than they can actually buy them, right? And so if we were thinking of looking at the effect of, for example, giving these farmers some livestock, goats, chicken, whatever, and we only look at them for one season, right? We say, oh, hey, look, these farmers who got some goats were able to withstand this drought or this flood better than the farmers who didn't. But again, the key thing about climate change is that if you don't follow that over time, we don't necessarily know whether this intervention would actually help the farmer stabilize as the climate continues to change and these shocks become more and more common. So this kind of brings up a big question about impact evaluation is like, how long do we really need to observe people to understand whether some of these interventions are really going to help them to basically smooth consumption as the climate continues to change. So one way to do this, and this is what this paper is about, is, well, if we have a bunch of data for a long period of time, so in this case, 40 plus years of data, we can look at how people are changing as the climate changes, not just in response to shocks specifically, right? And I keep saying that, but I think that's one of the key things here is that climate, the way people respond to a changing climate is not necessarily the same as the way they will respond to a single weather shock, right? So we got data from a bunch of different countries. You'll notice a lot of the data comes 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010-ish, and that's because a lot of this data comes from decennial censuses, and they tend to be around those 0 years, right? So we have a bunch of different countries, 20-some countries, thousands and thousands of admin 2. So, a government, the second government level. And it's data from both Africa and Asia. And what we're interested in looking at is how climate change changes the patterns of structural transformation. And as a development economist, when I think structural transformation, what I mean is how labor is reallocated out of agriculture and into other sectors. So something that we know commonly happens as countries develop is that as they become richer and richer, which is what this graph shows, the proportion of people who are employed in agriculture gets lower and lower and lower. This is true both in the cross section. So for example, if this year we compare richer countries to poorer countries, we see richer countries have fewer people in agriculture. But this is also true if we look within countries. So I live here in South Korea, just like the GCF people. And South Korea developed very rapidly over about 40 years. And the same thing happened within South Korea, right? Back in the 1960s, they had a very large proportion of their population employed in agriculture. And today it's very, very small. So this is true both when we look across countries, but also when we look within countries. And in this paper, what we're really curious, what we're trying to do is see how a changing climate affects these patterns of structural transformation, right? So if we look at places that tend to be getting hotter, for example, how does that affect these patterns that we think we know about, this pattern essentially, right? So how does the changing climate affect these? I'm not going to show you a table. Let me instead just tell you what we find. So As I already mentioned, higher GDP we know means lower agricultural employment. This is traditional structural transformation. If you ever hear an economist say structural transformation, that's what we mean. But something else we find is that higher temperatures keep people in agriculture. So in other words, for the same level of GDP, agricultural employment will be higher in areas with higher temperatures. Higher rainfall, on the other hand, has the opposite effect, right? So for the same level of GDP, agricultural employment will actually be lower if precipitation's higher. So one way to think about this, temperature and rainfall have opposite effects, because slightly higher rainfall on average is good for agriculture. Slightly higher temperatures on average in our sample is bad for agriculture. So they go in opposite directions, right? So not really the point of this, but something else I would point out is that actually we find that if you only include rainfall or temperature, you actually come to very different conclusions than if you include both. So climate change, not just are these difficulties of thinking about time, it's also difficult to measure, right? What is the appropriate variables to measure when we think about climate change? Is it just average temperature? Is it just average rainfall? We probably want to think about shocks, which we do. I don't include that here just because of time, right? So rainfall shocks, are you more likely to see droughts? Are you more likely to see floods? Things like that. Heat waves, especially in agriculture, can be very, very bad. A heat wave at the wrong time can kill crops, right? So that's something else to think about. But again, we do not actually see these same effects if we only look at weather shocks, right? So a weather shock does not tend to change the overall patterns of structural transformation. It's a one-time thing. These climate change variables, however, show that when we look over longer periods of time, so if we look at average rainfall instead of just this year's rainfall, we come to very different conclusions about the effects of these. Now, we just saw the the World Food Programme's Nepalese flood project, right? And if this is a project that is going to continue for the foreseeable future, then maybe it is actually fine to just look at whether this intervention helps households stabilize consumption in the face of a shock, right? Because if you can do that every time they have a shock, that's okay, right? But going back to the example I gave earlier about, for example, giving livestock to farmers, if you give livestock to farmers once and then they slowly have to get rid of that livestock as climate change leads to more and more shocks, it might not actually help them in the long run, even though we see in the short run it does, right? If you were going to give them goats every single year, it's probably fine to just look at what happens in that 1 year. But if you're not, it's going to be very different, right? And so in this paper, we look at labor. So specifically today, I talked about agriculture, right? But these things that we find here are probably also true for other types of outcomes related to climate change, right? It's not just about agricultural labor. You could think the same things about things like child labor, education, all sorts of stuff, because it's all intertwined. It all goes together. These questions around climate change are really, really big. And it's already been mentioned multiple times, right? This is not something that any one organization, any one university, any one country can do by itself, right? I really think this, as with most large social challenges, social problems, is something that we really have to collaborate on, right? As an academic, I collaborate with international organizations all the time, right? So like, for example, with the World Bank, I do a lot of work on poverty, because the skills that the World Bank has are very different from the skills I have, right? I do the same thing with the UN and helping them improve capacity building for, also related to poverty actually, for stats departments in developing countries, for example, right? And so I think a lot can be learned from making sure we think about collaborations as we move forward. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Josh, for the interesting presentation and for talking about your research. And I absolutely agree that the combination of precipitation temperatures is very important. And I know that there are certain indices that can capture, both things and can look at the combined effect of those. So thank you very much. Before I jump into the question in the chat box, I have one question to all three of you. And I wonder, so from our experience in the LORTA program, there are certain challenges conducting impact evaluations. So I just wonder if you can share a few challenges that you encounter in conducting impact evaluation. So I don't know, Nidhi, if you'd like to start, especially in the humanitarian sector, I think it would be interesting to know more, and then Josh, and then Susumu, if you'd like to come in as well, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. I think the one challenge that comes to mind is, since we work on RCTs and the designs can be a little rigid, and this poses a lot of challenge in the humanitarian settings where things are changing rapidly, possibly every day, right? So how do you keep adapting your design, your research design in accordance with what is actually happening on ground? So that is one challenge that we face. And yeah, so far it's been, some sleepless nights, some mini heart attacks in terms of what is happening in the field, but it's been okay so far. Yeah, but would be really happy to hear what Josh and Susumu have to say.
So the biggest challenge I face is probably not as interesting as the rest of you. As an academic, if I want to do an impact evaluation, I have to get a grant to do it. And finding money is actually very difficult. But in terms of actual practical challenges, if you're actually doing one, we're trying to right now, for example, work with a Ph.D. student and I are trying to work with a humanitarian agency in Ghana who works with refugees to implement an RCT, an experiment, to try to see basically the best use of the money they use. And one of the real difficulties we face is trying to find, again, this is as an academic, which is a little different from others, it's trying to find ways where I can collaborate with this humanitarian organization that has very different goals than I do, right? So what I mean by that is, yes, I am interested in learning what helps them, but as an academic, I actually have very clear publication goals that actually make a big deal, right? I have to be able to get that paper out of it. And so like trying to find like that happy middle ground where we both are able to benefit is actually the hardest thing.
Thank you for sharing, Josh.
Yeah, maybe one of the things that I can say is the timeline of it's a cycle of evaluation. It's a long process because we engage from a very, as I said, early stage of the project, and we work throughout the project cycle, right? So sometimes it's like, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, depending on the project. It's not because we are trying to measure the impact. Well, it's not because we are waiting for the disaster to happen, but we make sure that the intervention happens, and then we align with the data point to make some estimation or calculations. And often the change of the government throughout this process, or like the partners and the interest, securing the buy-in, all these matters to go through the whole process. So that's maybe the biggest challenge or difficulties of this kind of work. That's why the collaboration is really key. And for this specific project, I'm very fortunate to work with the Land Bank and Tagasa because they are really like trying to take ownership and get buy-in. So I see some colleague from Philippines, Edward, and then Mika and Paris. They joined today. Thank you for joining today for this session, and other colleagues that will get to join. But that's kind of course, we cannot do it alone, and we have to do it together.
Great. Thank you so much, Susumu. We have 3 questions to each of you in the chat, and if I may just read them to you. So first is for Josh. Is the population growth or decline also considered when number of people working from agriculture sector was analyzed?
So the short answer is yes. We didn't look at the effects because that wasn't our interest, but the short answer is yes.
Okay, great, thank you. For the presentation too, Nidhi, are the group B households the same ones from the group A? I don't know if we remember that slide, but maybe you could talk about.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks, Aimi. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. The group B is essentially a different set of households taken from the same common list with the same sort of vulnerability scores. And obviously we also did, balance checks to ensure that they are balanced on different, be it like food security indicators or other indicators that we had data on prior to the intervention actually happening. So they're taken from the same common list, but it's not that both the same household gets the transfers before and also after the flood peak. I hope that answers your question. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Nidhi. And also the last question for Susumu on the level of coordination. If you think that some metrics could be used to measure the level of coordination.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think, let me try to be clear, but it's not because this project doesn't need a coordination. It does need a coordination. I think the discussion point is the coordinated effort. We try to make things more efficiently and effectively for the project implementation. Since we are still not too far from the design stage, so we don't know. Maybe next year when we have the going through the process, maybe the finding or lessons is like, okay, it doesn't work. Well, we shouldn't do this, right? But I hope not. And then next year when we do have like a gLOCAL event, maybe again, then maybe we can invite again these project teams to share how it went well, or like how maybe we can potentially maybe even do better. To see how we can do this, but so it's not a matter of like a level of coordination, but how we can take initiative and try to find a space that we can work together. For the sake of time, I didn't go too much, but for example, we are working with FAO team to see how we measure resilience, for example, what kind of index that we can embed in our data collection so that we can more systematically measure the resilience from different interventions, and then so that we can see the impact of the project from GCF side and also FAO side. And or even farther, right? From other entities or institutions, we can measure and then compare this kind of interventions.
Thank you, Susumu. You mentioned an important topic, and if I may ask a question to Nidhi and Josh about data quality. So in order to construct this indices, we need a good data quality. And what we experienced in Malawi, for example, was that the data quality was not as good as we wanted, so we had to play with what we have. What we had to analyze what we have. Can you explain a little bit or share your experiences with data collection, and especially like in fragile setting, maybe? And maybe Josh, you can talk maybe about the data that you used in your research or any other experiences. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. In terms of data quality, that is a challenge, but especially when we get, even before the IE, right? Even when we receive the beneficiary lists, they have to be in a certain format. You need to make sure there are no duplicates, because you're going to use the same list for your randomization. Even little things like, your village names, if you're doing a village level randomization, shouldn't have duplicates, or they should actually exist, right? A lot of times there are errors because these lists are received from cooperating partners. So yeah, we've definitely faced those challenges in the past, and I personally work more on the data side as well on the impact evaluation. Quite a few challenges there, but we try to have certain checks in place. You have your usual data quality checks on a daily basis, or at least like every 2-3 days. We try and place a field coordinator there in every country where we're having an impact evaluation. So, just to make sure that if there are any errors, you can go back and tell the field teams that they should be taking care of certain aspects. Josh, you probably have more experience on this.
So I currently have an ongoing project in Bangladesh. We collected data for a different project in India during COVID, and we're putting together something right now for that project with refugees in Ghana. And in all three cases, the way we've gone about designing the data collection is to make sure, basically, so we actually employ a firm that specializes in data collection. So one thing we don't do in any of these three projects is have the actual organization who's implementing the program collect the data. And that's not because we don't trust them, it's just because that's not what they do, right? And so we make sure that we hire an actual data firm who does this like as their actual job to collect the data. So it's getting better and better. So 20 years ago, if you were going to collect survey data, an enumerator would come to your house, they'd have paper, they'd fill out paper, right? And then they take that back to another place, and then they would enter from that paper into a computer. But nowadays, what they do, at least the firms that we hire, they have tablets, and they go and do the data collection with a tablet. And so you actually remove one of those steps where you can possibly get error from doing that. One of the other cool things about these tablets, this is maybe too specific, but I think this stuff's really cool, is that you can build in checks to make sure that the number you entered isn't obviously wrong. So like, for example, if you are interviewing at Endline, you can have preloaded all the information of the household from baseline, right? And if you ask, what was your income this month? And they respond something that makes it seem like their income increased by 10 times from baseline, you can have the tablet flag it and be like, are you sure this is right? So this is the things that these data collection firms take very seriously, which at least in my experience, really can improve the quality of data. It's just making sure you hire people who do this for a living.
Thank you for sharing your experiences. We have 4 minutes left, and I would like maybe to give floor to you. Do you want to mention something that we didn't talk about, or any concluding thoughts or points that you would like to bring? Alternatively, I have another question. If I can ask a question on ethics. This is a tricky question, but I assume that you ask consent, when you collect the data. But also there are a lot of, pros and cons and ethical debate on conducting RCTs. Of course, in development, in less fragile settings, I would say, but especially humanitarian setting. Can you say something maybe about this? What do you think about conducting randomized control trial in humanitarian. Do you think it's ethical? Do you think it's unethical? And yeah.
Sure. This is a question that is asked of us many, many times, even within the organization by country officers who may be new also to RCTs or who may have been a part of debates, right, against RCTs. One thing that I do want to highlight here is the common ethical steps that everyone probably takes or should take is, an informed consent process that is, again, built into your survey CTO form that we use in every survey that we do, right? So that is one. Of course, we also get an ethical clearance from an international IRB or an institutional review board, right? So that is done. The third thing I do want to say that at WFP, at least, in our unit, we typically, in most IEs, never have a pure control group. So it's never that we are withholding support or assistance from anyone. We do what are called A/B testings. So we may have different treatment groups with different sort of receiving different forms of assistance, maybe, or in the case of the Nepal IE, we had two groups where the difference was the timing of the transfer. It's not that we are withholding support for anyone. It's just that programs come with a certain budget. So you can only, provide assistance to some people. And then for the others, you may receive additional grants. So we try and work around those ways. And withholding support or not giving support to anyone is something that, we're definitely strongly against. Over.
For sharing. Thank you for sharing. Josh, would you like to say anything on that?
Yeah, I'll keep it really short because I know we're almost out of time. So I think there's two separate issues with these RCTs. One is the purely academic research, and the other is this research when we're thinking about how a lot of these organizations who work with whether it's poor populations, whether it's vulnerable populations for other reasons, when they're trying to find the best use of their money, right? So this organization in Ghana, for example, one of their programs costs like $6,000 per person, 6,000 USD per person, right? And they have other programs that cost 5% of that, right? So like if you really want to find whether the people I've talked to, they don't think it's worth it. But how are you really going to know if it's worth it if you don't actually, evaluate it, right? You could take that $6,000 in theory, right? And if it were just as impactful as that one $300 treatment, you could go out and give it to 20 people instead of one, right? So I think in this setting specifically, I personally don't find anything immoral about randomizing. But I will say as an academic, this idea of not withholding treatment from anybody actually is one of the issues we've run up against in making sure we treat everyone eventually. So one thing we tried to do in Ghana is say, okay, we're going to treat this control group, but we're going to treat them next year, right? So just kind of trying to make sure they will get it, but we'll stagger it so we can try to figure out what the effects of these programs are.
Thank you very much, Josh. Susumu, would you like to maybe talk about ethical implications of using randomized control trials?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, maybe I'm a little very biased to run RCTs because I support, right? But I think the question is like not whether RCT is good or bad, but how we do it. But often we are not really looking, okay, what we can randomize and to write interesting papers or but it's more like the constraint that we are facing, probably like financial resources. It's a limited budget which we cannot cover the whole populations, or in that context, like what is ethical if we cannot reach to the whole population, right? So we need some kind of like selection or targeting. Something has to be done. or even the implementation capacity aspect, we cannot reach to everybody. In that context, we often use a phasing approach. So we go from one district or one area to the others to see, and we do adapt through the implementation, and we make some adjustment. So it's not as we think. I think I see Alfred's comment as well, but not the first person, or no, the opposite. The last person who receive is a worse off. Maybe sometimes those people who are receiving first can be worse off if we don't know if it's really working and how much it makes as a difference, right? So I think, yeah, we really have to be careful when we implement this approach, because it's very politically sensitive. But in many cases, if we make the process transparent and clear and explain so that people can understand, beneficiaries and also the control group or the participants can understand it, then we can avoid a lot of ethical issues.
Thank you very much, Susumu. We have last question. We're just a little bit over time, but maybe, I don't know, Josh, if you want to come in again about lean data and how to practically make impact evaluation leaner.
So, I mean, I think I would actually let someone like Nidhi answer this one. I think she's probably had more, I think she has more experience with impact evaluations than I do. So I'm going to let her answer.
Thanks, Josh. And thank you, Saloni, for your question. We actually, and honestly, thank you for asking this question, because at the impact evaluation unit in WFP, we are focusing on lean impact evaluations. Some ways that we do it is, especially in the humanitarian work stream that I was talking about, we don't always need to do a baseline. Right, and probably Josh can back me up on this with the academic chatter on this. But
if it's an RCT, then I agree.
Yes, it's an RCT, and we don't always need to do a baseline. What we do is at WFP we always have a targeting and a re-verification exercise that takes place, and that includes some surveys anyway. So this is part of the programming itself, right? So we add, if we can add a certain questions on, say, food security or whatever aspects, just some 5-6 questions which we think may be useful to get data on baseline data. We do that. We don't typically under the humanitarian work stream do a baseline. Secondly, just using existing data sources also, right? At WFP, we collect huge amounts of data, different forms of it, right? And we don't need to duplicate efforts. There are huge amounts of, like, I don't know, satellite data that's collected that we use. We've used this in Nepal, and we're also collaborating with the teams in WFP to use more of their data. There can be admin data that you can use. Like I was mentioning, the beneficiary data that is collected by WFP as part of their programming is something that we already use. So yeah, different forms of existing data can be used to make your IEs leaner in exchange, I mean, instead of doing a baseline.
Thank you very much. Susumu, yes, you are muted.
Yeah, maybe I can also comment on Alf's another comment of the spillover and unintended effect due to RCT. I think it's not unique to RCT, right? So it can be any project interventions which can have a positive or negative impact, and also unintended, and then the spillover effect. So it's not unique to RCT. What we do in the context of RCT or impact assessment, we always try to, of course, measure quantitatively that this effect both positive and negative, and then including the spillover to quantify and to show in numerical numbers. So that's what impact assessment or impact evaluation is trying to do. But I think it's the same issue can be applied to any development or climate interventions.
Thank you very much, Susumu. And I think on this note, we're closing our event. Thank you very much, Nidhi and Josh and Susumu, for your presentations, and participants for their questions and for coming to listen in. Please check our LORTA webpage. So I'm putting the link in the chat. Please come in and yeah, stay tuned for our impact evaluation reports and some stories from the field. Thank you, everyone, and have a great end of the day. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.